passage of the Tea Act in 1773 by Parliament began a chain of events, a sequence of events that would result within a few short years of the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775 and the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain by the American colonies in 1776. What we're going to do in this lesson is examine this chain of events. We're going to begin with the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party that was a result of this Tea Act. Second of all, we're going to look at the Parliament's passage of the Coercive Acts, because this was a response to the Boston Tea Party. And then we're going to look at the meeting of the First Continental Congress in 1774, which was a response to the passage of the Coercive Acts. And then we're going to look at the outbreak of war in 1775 and ultimately the decision by the colonists to seek independence in 1776. So first, let's look at the passage of the Tea Act. In 1773, Parliament acted to pass the Tea Act basically to bail out the East India Company. You know, bailouts aren't anything new in American or world history. The East India Company, it turns out, was in financial difficulties. They had all this tea from India to sell, and nobody was buying it, or not enough people were buying it. So what the Tea Act did was it allowed the British East India Company to sell its tea directly to the colonists, and they wouldn't have to pay the tax. Therefore, they could sell this tea at a cheaper price than American merchants who would have to pay the tax on tea. Also, as part of the deal, certain merchants were given contracts by the British East India Company to sell this tea, and among the people winning contracts was the family business of Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts. We've already mentioned him in a previous lesson. Now, the colonists never liked the customs duty on tea. Remember, that had been left over from the Revenue Act of 1767. And they were very angry at this act because basically it stunk of cronyism. I mean, basically they were giving bailouts to the British East India Company. They were favoring certain insiders like Thomas Hutchinson. So a lot of colonists, especially merchants, were just up in arms. So they decided to take action and to protest the Tea Act. So on the evening of December 16th, 1773, a protest was organized by, guess who, the Sons of Liberty, the Boston Sons of Liberty. They disguised themselves as Indians. They boarded the ships of the British East India Company that were in Boston Harbor, and they got on the ships and they proceeded to dump all that tea right into Boston Harbor. And this event became known as the Boston Tea Party. I mean, it really wasn't a tea party per se, but that was what it was called. So they threw the tea into the water. And this was an act of, well, this was an act of vandalism. It was an act of terrorism. And it was a violation of the property rights of the British East India Company. And Parliament, and King George III, of course, were very, very angry when they heard about the Boston Tea Party. So they decided that they needed to take action to punish Boston, and so the Parliament passed the Coercive Acts in early 1774. And these Coercive Acts were known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, and they were intolerable. Now, under the Coercive Act, first of all, the port of Boston was closed until the people of Boston came up with the money to compensate the British East India Company for all that destroyed tea. Second of all, under this law, the Massachusetts governor was given a lot more power. Now he could appoint sheriffs, he could appoint judges, he could even appoint members of the upper house of the legislature, the council, without getting the consent or the approval of the legislature. And another part of the plan was that town meetings were limited. Now towns in Massachusetts could only have one town meeting. In other words, the British government didn't want the colonists gathering together and discussing these problems. And finally, the governor was given the authority to appropriate private homes, take private homes, and then place British troops into these homes. So now the colonists, many colonists were outraged by the Coercive Acts because, first of all, they believed that by depriving power, taking away power from their local colonial legislature, this was a violation of their rights and a violation and taking away self-government. They also were appalled by the taking away of property, seizing people's property to place soldiers in people's homes. That was another violation of the rights of Englishmen, in placing soldiers in private homes at a time of peace. Now, the committees of correspondence, they were busy, they were active, and soon news of what was going on in Boston were spread throughout the colonies. So what happened in Boston became news everywhere, from Virginia to Georgia to New Hampshire to Pennsylvania. And many colonists were convinced that the British government was involved in some kind of conspiracy to deprive them of their rights and to take away their rights, not just in Massachusetts, but everywhere. Now, these fears that the colonists had were justified in their eyes by the passage by Parliament of the Quebec Act in 1774. Now, the coercive acts and the Quebec Act had nothing to do with each other, but what happened was that the Canada had been acquired by the French back in 1763, but it had never had any kind of government. What the Quebec Act of 1774 was to give a government to Canada. Now, under this act, there was no representative assembly allowed in Canada. The governor could rule by decree. Now, the way that the British government figured, the people who lived there were French and had never had a representative government, so it made no sense to impose one on them. Another problem was that they allowed the Roman Catholic Church to be the official church because most of the French who lived in Canada were Catholics. Now, these actions by the British government, the Quebec Act, was seen as terrible by colonists because colonists, when they looked at it, they said, well, see, what happened in Quebec is going to happen to us. They're going to take away our elected legislatures, so we'll just be in the same boat as the Canadians. And also, that idea of allowing the French to remain Roman Catholics, you got to remember that most American colonists were Protestant. And many Americans, including Samuel Adams, believed that the Roman Catholic Church was evil, that they associated the Catholic Church with tyranny, with superstition, with savagery, and the fact that the British government was allowing a tyrannical, superstitious, monstrous institution like the Roman Catholic Church to operate, that was seen as a terrible thing and a threat to the liberty of the colonists. Now, the fear that the British government had some kind of conspiracy was afoot, these fears were fed actually by English writers. See, at the time that this was going on, there were English writers over in England known as radical Whigs. They included such persons as Thomas Gordon and John Trenchard, and they were writing pamphlets very critical of the British government. They believed that the British political system as is was corrupt, that too much power and tyrannical power was in the hands of the king and his ministers. And they believed that the system of patronage was used to corrupt the system. And what these radical Whigs were calling for were sweeping reforms to make Parliament more representative of the British people and to allow for more freedom of the press. Now, these pamphlets written by these radical Whigs, these pamphlets were being brought over to the colonies, and the colonists were reading these pamphlets. And these pamphlets convinced many colonists that, in fact, King George III and his ministers were, in fact, corrupt and tyrants and plotting to take away their liberty, their rights as Englishmen. Now, in the spring and summer of 1774, what happened is that as more and more colonies distrusted British officials, they decided to take matters into their own hands. Now, what they did in many colonies was to set up what were called committees of safety. And these committees were designed to maintain law and order because the judges and the sheriffs appointed by the governor were considered untrustworthy, that they were agents of corrupt royal power. So basically, at this time, the colonists were taking matters in their own hands at the colonists in each colony and running their own affairs, and colonial legislatures began to meet without even getting the consent of the governor. So at the grassroots level, the colonists were already beginning to organize themselves and assert their own self-government independence. Now, it was also decided that all the colonists would send delegates to a Continental Congress. And in September of 1774, 12 colonies, all the colonies except Georgia, sent delegates to Philadelphia. And there were 55 delegates in all, and they convened as the first Continental Congress in September of 1774. And the purpose of this first Continental Congress was to address the coercive acts and the Quebec Act and to take action. Now, while they were meeting, what happened is that Paul Revere showed up. Paul Revere showed up, and he brought with him what were called the Suffolk Resolves. Now, Suffolk was a town in Massachusetts, and they had drafted a series of resolves. And so what Paul Revere did when he came to the Continental Congress, he said, here are the Suffolk Resolves, let's vote on them. And it was not much of a majority, but they voted in favor of the Suffolk Resolves. Now, what did the Continental Congress decide to do? First of all, they decided that throughout the colonies there was going to be a boycott of English goods. Just like they had done in 1767 with the non-importation agreements, now they were going to continue that colonial-wide and not buy English goods. And this is another thing they decided to do. They decided that in each colony they would organize a militia, that the colonists would collect arms and be ready to fight, if necessary, to protect their freedoms, their rights as Englishmen. Now, Congress also declared or issued what became known as the Declaration of American Rights. Thomas Jefferson helped draft it. And this was a document to be sent to King George III. And basically, in a nutshell, what it said was that Parliament had no authority to impose taxes or laws on the colonists. But they were quick to affirm that they were still loyal to the king. So they were saying that Parliament could not tax them, but they were still loyal to the king. And they also decided that they would meet the following spring in 1775 to see how things were going. Now, shortly after the meeting of this first Continental Congress in the fall of 1774, things began to unravel and eventually war would break out. Now, it turns out that King George III and Lord North, they disagreed completely with the assertions of the Continental Congress. They did believe that Parliament could impose taxes and laws on the colonists, and they continued to maintain troops in the port of Boston, and the port of Boston remained closed. Now, in Massachusetts, where most of the colonists were angry about what was going on, that's where they began to organize a militia. Remember, the Continental Congress had called for the creation of militias. Now, in Massachusetts, the militia were called the Minutemen, because at a moment's notice, in a minute's notice, they were ready to fight for liberty. So in 1774 into 1775, these Minutemen were drilling, they were collecting weapons, and when news of this got to Great Britain, it was decided by Lord North and King George that something had to be done. So in April of 1775, Lord North instructed the governor of Massachusetts to find this store of weapons, to seize the store of weapons, and to arrest the leaders of the militia, including, of course, Samuel Adams, familiar name, and John Hancock. Now, what happened was that news of this order reached the ears of the Boston Committee of Safety. They were in charge of law and order, and they decided to send out Paul Revere to warn the Minutemen that the British were coming. And this is the famous midnight ride of Paul Revere. Now, it only lasted about 10 minutes before he was arrested. It wasn't much of a ride, but it was made famous in poems and poetry. Now, what happened, though, when the British marched from Boston to Concord, where the militia weapons were stockpiled, the Minutemen knew they were coming. So on the way from Boston to Concord is the little town of Lexington. Now, in Lexington, about 70 Minutemen had collected, and they were there to confront the British soldiers who were marching to Concord. Now, when the British troops arrived, they ordered the Minutemen to disperse. Now, there was a couple of moments of tenseness, and then all of a sudden, somebody, to this day, I don't think they really know who, somebody fired a shot. And when it was all said and done, a number of Minutemen lay dead on the Lexington Square. So after the Minutemen of Lexington dispersed, the troops continued their march to Concord. Now, all this activity had been to no avail because when they got to Concord, they discovered that the entire stockpile had been removed. So then they had to march back from Concord back to Boston. Now, it was at Concord Bridge on the way back to Boston that another skirmish took place, and that marked another battle of the opening of the American Revolutionary War. So these skirmishes at Lexington and Concord are seen by historians as the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Now, when the war began, the colonists were still believed that they could fight but still maintain their loyalty to the King of Great Britain. So now in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened. Remember, they had planned to convene back in the fall. Now, they convened in Philadelphia, and it was at this meeting they decided that it was necessary to fight, that they needed to raise armies and defend their liberties. And in fact, in June of 1775, the Continental Congress created the Continental Army to be the army to defend the colonies. And they appointed George Washington of Virginia to command this army. He was one of the few colonists who had any kind of command experience. He'd been a colonel during the French and Indian War. Now, Congress still believed that there could be a peaceful resolution. So Congress, in that summer of 1775, issued the Olive Branch Petition, asking King George III to call off the troops, to end hostilities, and to open up some kind of negotiations. Congress also wanted to defend its actions, so they issued another document called the Declaration of Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. What they wanted to do is to explain to King George III why they were up in arms, why they were fighting. Now, George III and Lord North, when they heard word of these documents, they took no notice of them because it was their belief that the colonists were in rebellion. And the only way to deal with the colonists was by force. They believed that by a strong show of force, they could crush this rebellion and end it right there and then and would not have to make any compromises. So what happened is, instead of there being any kind of peace, in the summer and fall of 1775, what we see is an escalation of war, and the hostilities escalated and spread to other colonies. By June of 1775, we had the first major battle of the war. It was fought just outside of Boston, and it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. It's actually fought on Breed's Hill, but it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, that was the first major engagement between the colonists and the British Army, and the colonists lost that battle. They had to withdraw from their position, but they did put a lot of casualties on the British in that battle itself. Now, what we see also happening is that not only were they fighting in Massachusetts, but the war spread to Virginia and the Carolinas. The governor of Virginia, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, he knew that a lot of prominent planters like George Washington were part of this rebellion. So he announced that if any slaves in Virginia, if any slaves left the plantation and agreed to fight for the British king as loyalist militia, they would receive their freedom. And now this proclamation by Lord Dunmore, all that did was to really anger a lot of Virginia planters and made them more determined to fight and to wage war. Now another thing that George III did was that in the fall of 1775, he hired mercenaries. It turns out that the war was very unpopular in Great Britain, and George III knew there might be a problem recruiting sufficient troops to fight over in the colony. So he decided to hire mercenaries from the Duchy of Hesse in Germany. Remember, the kings of England were Germans. They were related. They were from the House of Hanover. They had a lot of contacts with German aristocrats. So these Hessians, they were hired as hired killers, basically, to fight against the colonists. Now, this really bothered the colonists. It really angered them that their own king would hire hired guns to come in and kill them. So by the end of 1775, a lot of colonists were thinking, hey, should we really be loyal to this king? Look what all he's done. Do we owe him our loyalty? Now, while this was going on, in January of 1776, an Englishman by the name of Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. Now, Thomas Paine had lived all of his life in England, and he had come as a young man and lived in Philadelphia. He became a friend of Benjamin Franklin, and all of a sudden he became very excited about the idea of independence and creating a republic. So in 1776, he published this pamphlet called Common Sense, and the whole purpose of the pamphlet was to make the case that the American colonists ought to completely throw off any allegiance to King George III, and that they should become an independent republic. No longer subjects of a king, but citizens of a republic. Now, Thomas Paine wrote the book in plain English, and because he wanted lots of Americans to read it. He didn't use a lot of fancy language. He also didn't quote a lot of scholars. The only book that he quoted from in the entire pamphlet was the Bible, because he knew that most colonists had an understanding of the Old and New Testament. So he wrote this book, this pamphlet, and thousands of copies were sold, and it was a bestseller, and colonists were eating it up. And it's believed that the publication of this pamphlet was very influential in convincing many colonists to seek independence and become a republic. Now, in January of 1776, Massachusetts, of course Massachusetts, Boston, they became the first legislature to pass a resolution calling for independence and the creation of a republic. And after Massachusetts passed that resolution, all other colonies followed suit. Now, in June of 1776, Continental Congress asked Thomas Jefferson to draft a Declaration of Independence. And on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress approved and publicized the Declaration of Independence that had been largely drafted by Thomas Jefferson. Now, declaring independence and winning independence are two separate things. And so we've come to the point where the United States has declared its independence. Now we're going to, in the next lesson, we're going to discuss the American Revolution, where the colonists won their independence.